Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today for our NGSS Test Prep with Individual Assessments webinar. This is actually the second webinar in a series that we're running called Fueling Mastery for the NGSS, where we're talking about different assessment strategies that y'all could potentially implement in this upcoming school year. And so I'll go ahead and get us started by introducing myself as you all are introducing yourselves. My name is Emily Miller. My pronouns are she, her. I was a high school chemistry teacher for 10 years prior to coming here with Inner Orbit. And during that time, I taught alternative learning program, I taught regular chem, I taught honors chem. So I had a lot of different opportunities to try a lot of different strategies with a lot of different students. During that time, I was also an NGSS pioneer and advocate within my science department. And I also had the pleasure of being a PLC lead within my department, and I got to lead a lot of data-driven dialogue, which is one of my favorite things to do. I'm a bit of a data nerd. And now I have the joy of partnering with districts to help them implement Inner Orbit. And as you all heard, I'm starting a new journey, and I tried mushroom coffee today.
I don't know about mushroom coffee. Maybe I will need to try it to see if I kind of like it. But I don't know. We'll see about that. And thank you again so much for being here. My name is Julia Monta. I was a teacher and a tutor for elementary students in the Dominican Republic for about 4 years. But now I've been also supporting teachers and districts with NGSS implementation then for the next 4 years after that. And I've been partnering, providing guidance to schools and districts implementing their assessment structures in their NGSS instruction. So I'm really excited to talk today a little bit more about individual assessments. And actually, I really like matcha. I'm not a coffee person, as I said before. I know Emily, she loves coffee. So yeah, it's just what I can say about it. I would very much rather drink a lot of matcha. Cool. And I'm going to walk you through what we're going to do today, our objective and our agenda for this afternoon. So today our objective is to explore how NGSS aligned individual assessments are empowering teachers to track student understanding and drive instruction. We're also going to reflect on how building your own assessments can support your classroom goals using real examples from our Inner Orbit partner districts. And we're going to be here for about 45 minutes, maybe a little less. Maybe we'll have some time for questions at the end. But for our agenda today, we're first, as we always start, talking about what is Inner Orbit in case you're not really familiar with it. Then we're actually going to define what individual assessments are. And Emily's going to do those two things. Then I'm actually going to walk you through different individual assessment types and use cases with our partner districts. We're going to go over diagnostics, formatives and summatives, and how to build those, which types of questions to include, and what assessment serves what purpose in instruction. Then after that, we're going to talk about what we could do next. So if we like these assessments, if we want to implement them in our classrooms, what are ways that we could start with this? And then we're going to wrap up. So that's our agenda for today. I am also ready, as this little cat is with the glasses. So Emily, I'm really happy to pass it on to you so you can talk to us a little bit more about what is Inner Orbit.
Thank you so much, Julia. I'm also ready. So again, we just want to take a little bit of time just to share with you what Inner Orbit is and what we do here. So Inner Orbit is high integrity 3D assessments that give you meaningful and actionable student data. So all of our assessment items are actually tied to novel phenomena. And then we write these rigorous, high quality assessments that range everywhere from one-dimensional prior knowledge questions all the way up to three-dimensional rigorous sense-making questions. And then this leads to our highly detailed reports, which give three-dimensional data. And we're actually going to have an opportunity to look at some examples of those reports today in the webinar. What Inner Orbit also does is we try to make the NGSS accessible for both you and your students through innovative approaches to sense-making. If y'all are NGSS experts or new to it, it can be a lot to tackle. And so what we want to try to do here is make it a little bit easier to wrap your head around and to implement in your classroom for both you and your students to grapple with and understand. And the last thing, Inner Orbits is guidance. We use a lot of supporting resources like this webinar and professional development to help you reach your NGSS goals. So not only do we do these webinars, we offer other professional developments within the school. We offer trainings in order to give everybody the tools and equipment they need to get where they want to go. So now that you know a little bit more about who we are and what we do, we want to talk a little bit about what we are here to do today, which is individual assessments. Now, y'all might be wondering, what is an individual assessment? So here at Inner Orbit, we have kind of come up with these three different assessment orbits, if you will. And our goal with this is to essentially tailor some different assessments to meet anybody where they might be at within their NGSS and sense making journey. So regardless if you are an NGSS expert or you're incredibly new to it, Inner Orbit has some tools and resources available and an assessment strategy available to you in order to start your journey to see and help you get to those science goals that we were mentioning before. Today, our focus is going to be on these individual assessments. As I mentioned earlier, this is a three-part webinar series. Last week, we actually did a webinar on common assessments, which you can find on our YouTube channel, which we'll share a little bit about here at the end. Today, we're doing individual assessments. And next week, we're going to be talking about sense-making practice. So again, what are these individual assessments? Individual assessments are teachers building their own assessments to gather data from their students. So kind of to juxtapose common assessments are either built by administrators or built by a PLC. And it's kind of this group collaborative effort to administer this assessment by multiple people within that same grade band or content area. An individual assessment is I'm a teacher building my own assessments for my own students. And really the purpose behind this is to collect that student-specific, just-in-time data for progress towards proficiency. And by the goal of this is we want to be able to track and respond to student understanding based on that data. So we want to be able to see what our students know and then be able to gather the data to see what they know to then inform instructional shifts after that point based on our specific students and our classroom and their needs. So one thing that we were curious about is if you wanted to go ahead and answer in the chat, what ways do you think individual assessments could best impact your school or district? So rather than common assessments, is there something that individual assessments could do to best impact your team? And we've got three different kind of ideas here in the poll to kind of get your brain cooking a little bit. So one of them is using relevant phenomena to engage students. As a teacher, you know your students best. So you know what their interests are, you know their background, and therefore you could pick phenomena that would actually be interesting for them rather than in a common assessment setting, you're trying to meet the masses of so many different individuals. The other thing you can do is you can appropriately scaffold to your specific student needs. Common assessments might be based on different standards or benchmarks or proficiency scales, but as a teacher, you know where your students are at, so you know where you need to start with them in order to scaffold them up to that hopeful proficiency level later on. And then the other one is being able to gather data for real-time instructional shifts. So I know what I'm teaching when, I can administer assessments based on what I'm teaching when, and then I can get data to actually make those decisions after that. So our number one answer here was appropriately scaffolding assessments to student needs. This one to me is huge. With that common assessment data, you get that large picture snapshot of how everybody is doing, which is really important, right? To know as a collective where strengths and weaknesses could be. But there could be a wide range of where everybody is with that common assessment data. And with a teacher being able to give those individual assessments, you can decide the starting point. You can decide how rigorous the scaffolding needs to be to fit the students that are in your classroom. And as a result, you get some awesome data. And when you build your assessments, you can get some awesome phenomena. So really, it can be a win-win all the way around. So now that we talked a little bit about how individual assessments can positively impact, we want to go ahead and talk about when individual assessments could potentially be appropriate. Because while there are a lot of different assessment strategies, all the assessment strategies aren't necessarily the best in different contexts or at different times. So individual assessments are most effective when teachers need flexible, fast insight into student understanding. They thrive in classrooms where teachers want data specific to their instruction. They may not have common planning time, and they need to make those quick, informed instructional decisions on their own. So some things to consider when you're asking yourself, are individual assessments the right strategy for me and my team is, do teachers need that flexibility to assess based on what they just taught? Are teachers working independently without shared curriculum? That's a big hurdle for common assessments. If you don't have common curriculum across the board, individual assessments is a great place to start in order to start collecting that data and getting that exposure to NGSS-based assessments and phenomena. Also, does your team have unique circumstances? Maybe you're working in a school where you're a singleton teacher and you're the only one teaching biology. Well, then individual assessments kind of falls in your lap at that point. Maybe you are working with a group of students within special education or who have special needs, and you need that really specific tailored scaffolding, or you're working with English language learners. So if you've got those unique circumstances, being able to build your own assessments to fit those needs can be a really powerful tool. Another question to consider is there a need to adjust instruction in real time? So getting that consistent data throughout the lesson and throughout the learning gives you that ability then to adjust instruction right then and there as needed. As you're considering these questions, as you're considering these circumstances, if this doesn't feel like this fits your need and your situation, that is again why here at Inner Orbit, we've got these 3 different assessment orbits: common assessments, individual, and sense-making practice. And we did one last week. We're doing another next week. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here at the end if you're interested. Now, the 3 different individual assessments we're going to be diving into here today are diagnostic assessments, formative assessments, and summative assessments. So if you've been in the education space for a minute, these words are probably not new to you in a lot of ways. But what we're going to be sharing with you is how real teachers, how real schools use diagnostic, formative, and summative assessments with Inner Orbit. So how do they build them? How do they use them, and what data do they get as a result of using these assessments? So that's what we're really here to share with you today, so you can get a really clear picture and a clear vision of what this could potentially look like for you if you feel like this is a good fit. Before we dive in, we just want to do a quick little recap on NGSS assessment terminology. Again, if you're new to the NGSS or you've been here for a minute, it's a big old alphabet soup. So just to get us all on the same page, within the NGSS, rather than traditional standards, the NGSS focuses on what they call performance expectations. So really, it's this idea of what students should be able to do to demonstrate their understanding. And this is where those 3 dimensions come in. So every performance expectation or standard, if that's a more common term, has a DCI component, a disciplinary core idea, an SCP component, a science and engineering practice, and a cross-cutting concept component, or a CCC. Essentially, the disciplinary core idea is the content. Like, we got to know what a mitochondria is, like if we're going to talk about biology, right? So that's just the information and the content. The practices are what students are doing. Can students look at a model of a cell and interpret it? Can students look at a graph and look at a data table and get information from it? And the cross-cutting concept is how students are thinking. These are these principal ideas in science that repeat constantly. This idea of patterns, this idea of scale and proportion, this idea of cause and effect. And there are ways that we can approach different problems and situations. So what I have here is a traditional performance expectation from the NGSS. So it is 3 LS4 3, which means it's 3rd grade. LS4 is Life Science 4. 3. And this performance expectation has those 3 different components to it. The science and engineering practice, which is engaging in argument from evidence. Notice how it says they have to construct an argument with evidence. The disciplinary core idea, in this case, it is adaptation. So this idea that certain organisms can survive well or not survive well in particular habits, that's the content. And then our cross-cutting concept is cause and effect. So if an organism lives in this habitat, what is the effect of living in that habitat? Again, with these 3 different dimensions of the NGSS, this actually gives us a few different types of questions we can ask students. In order for students to master the NGSS, they need to be able to group all of these dimensions together into one problem. And we call that a 3-dimensional question. But there are also 1-dimensional and 2-dimensional questions that we can use to scaffold students up to be able to answer 3-dimensional questions. So a 1-dimensional question is purely just content. So what is the powerhouse of the cell? Mitochondria. 1D question. Is it important? Yeah, because we got to know what the mitochondria is. But do we stop there? No. Then we have 2-dimensional questions. So this is where we take the content and we layer in either the cross-cutting concept or the science and engineering practice. This gives students a chance to flex these skills independently with the content. And then ultimately, our end goal is our 3-dimensional questions, where students are answering a question that has components of every single dimension within it at the same time. And if students can successfully answer these 3-dimensional questions, we can confidently say that students are getting towards mastery with that performance expectation or standard. All right, so we know what individual assessments are. We know we're going to talk about diagnostic, formative, and summative. And now we hopefully have a nice little NGSS refresher. So Julia is now going to walk us through some different district and school examples of real teachers using inner orbit and the assessments they build and the data they get as a result. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Emily, for giving us that context. That is so important for us to understand how these assessments are built. How do we build these assessments? Where do we even start? What does it fit my context? So even though we're going to talk about these assessments through the lens of inner orbit, this information could be so useful to you if you're not using inner orbit yet. So yeah, I'm happy to dive into one of the most common types of individual assessments, diagnostics. And now, as we know, diagnostic assessments include mostly one-dimensional questions. So they're focused on prior knowledge or core disciplinary content. So when we talk about rigor, we're talking about DCI-based questions only. We're not integrating SCP or the cross-cutting concept here, just content knowledge. And the purpose here is to gauge what students already know before instruction even begins. So we're not necessarily flying bird without seeing where our students are at. We can tailor actually our instruction based on students' needs. And these can be used at different points in the year, I guess. So maybe we do a diagnostic if we're starting in September or in August at the course level to see what students already know with the grade level content. Maybe sometimes we need to do it at the unit level to check for readiness for upcoming concepts, or even at the lesson level is something that we can do to get a quick pulse on understanding before we dive into instruction. So these kinds of assessments help ensure students overall are starting from a place of support and that our instruction is meeting students where they're at. So here's an example on how a district is using individual diagnostic assessments to support their NGSS instruction. And this district is located in Maryland, and they're using a unit diagnostic at the beginning of the unit, which is a great way to set the stage for learning. And this particular assessment included 12 DCI-only questions aligned to the unit standards, and it was designed to assess both prior knowledge and on-grade level content. Again, just to recap, the goal here is to figure out before instruction begins what students already know and what gaps there are so we can address those. And you can see the types of phenomena that they use to frame these questions. You might be like, but if these are DCI only questions, why do we even use phenomena? So using this type of phenomena and engaging phenomena helps students get into the mindset of science thinking. This is something that we're going to do with 2- and 3-dimensional questions. So even though students are representing here their knowledge and not necessarily engaging with the SCP or the cross-cutting concepts still, it gives us a natural transition into deeper 3-dimensional tasks that will happen later in the unit. So this is a great way to look at this. Even though we're not necessarily engaging in sense making just yet, we can still use the phenomena for students to represent their knowledge. Now let's take a closer look as to what this individual diagnostic assessment looked like in practice. And again, this was given at the beginning of the unit, and the performance expectations that were assessed, which were HSLS 2.1 and HSLS 2.2. So these questions were focusing on prior knowledge and core disciplinary content at the one-dimensional level. As you can see with these questions, they're all DCI aligned and focused on key foundational concepts biodiversity, population stability, and ecosystem limits. So the first question that we see here is asking students if they recognize that the resources in an ecosystem are limited. Even though it's referring to the phenomena, we're still not asking them to do anything else. The second question is asking them to apply understanding from population dynamics. And the third one checks prior knowledge using terms like biodiversity and in these contexts. So all questions are focused on prior knowledge and grade level knowledge, and they don't need to engage with the dimensions, but it will give us a clear snapshot of what students already understand. Now, when we look at the data that this assessment will yield, we'll see here kind of like the completion levels, the average, and students scored about a 74% overall. And what's great here is how the data is immediately actionable. So we can quickly see how many students fall into each performance band here, and we can tie every question back to specific DCIs. As you can see, there were 3 different DCIs that were assessed: LS2A, LS2C, and ESS3C. So all these things, we see that students did really well on 2 DCIs, but there was one where we maybe still need a little bit more support in grade 6-8, which is ecosystem dynamics and resilience. So that might suggest a need to reteach or reinforce that concept, because when we actually go back into the high school level, then these misconceptions and these gaps may arise when students are engaging in sense-making performances. So now that we looked at what diagnostic assessments can look like and what kind of meaningful data it can provide, you might be thinking, how do I even build my own assessment maybe? So if you want to actually do that, we do have on InterOrbit the opportunity to do so. And if you're using a curricula next year, like Amplify, LabAIDS, Mystery Science, New Visions, or OpenSciEd, is really easy for you to create from our already pre-made assessments and actually build those. It's a good idea to start with a diagnostic, and we're going to drop a link in the chat in case you want to really explore a little bit more about how to use InterOrbit. And let me drop that link just now. We'll be in contact with you, and we'll share an access link where you'll actually be able to create your own account and have access to InterOrbit for a full month and actually create your own diagnostic assessments if that's something that you're interested in. Awesome. Now moving on to our second type of assessment, formative assessment. This is personally my favorite, but I don't know who's playing favorites here. Well, I am, and this is my favorite one. And this is one of the most powerful tools for guiding day-to-day instruction. These can include one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional questions, but unlike diagnostics, they typically don't include prior knowledge. Instead, they're designed to check student understanding during instruction. And the purpose here is to keep a pulse on learning as it's happening. So instead of just waiting until the end of the unit, this is something that we can do maybe in the middle of the unit after a specific lesson or even across the whole course, just to understand if there are shifts that we need to make. And these are flexible. We can include a few one-dimensional questions to see if content landed, a few two-dimensional tasks to connect concepts, cross-cutting concepts and science and engineering practices, and then a short three-dimensional performance to check if students are ready to move forward. And in terms of timing, they can be used maybe across the whole course, maybe within a specific unit, or during a single lesson to check for understanding on a particular concept or performance expectation. And these assessments help you respond to student needs in real time, so instruction is actually adapted. Now, for this district example, here's a great one, and this is actually from a district in Kentucky. And this was a lesson level formative, so it only included 5 questions, and it was used mid-lesson to check understanding in real time. As you can see, this is the phenomena that they used, and we're looking here at an engaging phenomena-driven context that pulls students in. So this flexible assessment is going to help us figure out if students are ready to move on, if they need a quick reteach, or if they're ready to dive deeper into the dimensions without any scaffolding. Now, for this specific assessment and taking a closer look to what this lesson level formative looked like, this one is around the phenomena that we already saw, and it's aligned to MS-LS41, and it focuses on evidence of common ancestry. So you'll see it includes 5 different questions here with blends of one-dimensional, two-dimensional, and three-dimensional items, giving students multiple entry points and different rigor levels to show their understanding, really. So the first item, as you can see here, is a one-dimensional core content question just focusing on the content. So students, can you recall what we studied to understand the diversity and change of life on Earth? Then the second and third questions are two-dimensional questions, one focused on the cross-cutting concept and the other one on the science and engineering practice. In this case, the cross-cutting concept was patterns. The science and engineering practice was analyzing and interpreting data. And then the final item is a three-dimensional sense-making question. And this, at the end of the day, we're aiming for students to be able to answer these types of questions independently without any scaffolding. And it was asking students to synthesize information across both figures that we see here and apply their understanding in a sequence-based reasoning tasks. So what's powerful here is that students are applying their knowledge in this context, not just recalling, but they're actually building up towards that sense-making performance at the end. So it helps not only us check for understanding with the scaffolds and understand if there's one question maybe that students struggle with, but it also helps students progress in their, it helps us gradually build up to more complex three-dimensional tasks. Now, if we take a look at the kind of student data that comes from a lesson level formative assessment, like the one that we just reviewed, students are looking at a 5-question formative quiz. We are looking at a 5-question formative quiz that students took, and we can see the average score was 55%. So it's giving us a clear snapshot of where students are at. As we can see here, and I know it's kind of small, but the SCPs, the biggest challenge was analyzing and interpreting data. And when we look at the question levels, we see at the question specifically, we see that students did well on DCI only questions, scoring over 75% correct. But when it comes to the two-dimensional questions that combine SCPs and the DCI, they had only about 29% accuracy. So that's a signal, right? It tells us if students, they might understand the content, but they need a little bit more support when it comes to analyzing and interpreting data, this specific science and engineering practice. And at the end of the day, that's what we want to know. And now for our last type of assessment, the summative assessments. It's not my favorite, but it's my second favorite, let's call it. So this is the last type of individual assessment that we're going to go over today. And these are designed to assess three-dimensional sense-making proficiency at the end of instruction. So unlike diagnostics or formatives, which guide instruction and maybe give some students some scaffold, these are meant to capture mastery. The rigor here is high. There's no the mitochondria is the blank of the cell anymore. Students need to be making those connections. And when we talk about something, they need to understand that we are actually tying that to what we learned about in class. So the purpose here is clear. We want to know if students reached proficiency after instruction. And the timeline, again, can be flexible. We can do it as a whole course, summative. Did students reach mastery across this whole course? Or maybe at the unit level for understanding, maybe for a full unit, and then at the lesson level. Again, this assessment will give us the clearest picture of student proficiency. So if we're trying to understand where students are at, a formative is the best choice. If we're trying to see before we go into instruction, if there's anything missing, if there are any gaps that we need to address, a diagnostic is the best assessment. But when we're talking about summative, we are just trying to measure proficiency with no scaffolds. So with this district example, actually, this is a district in New Jersey, and this was a less informative, a single performance expectation summative, and it was designed to measure mastery at the end of a lesson. This is about, the phenomena used here was, why does this balloon blow up? It included 5 questions. It was aligned to a specific lesson standard, as I mentioned before, and it used 3-dimensional questions to push students to apply their learning in this meaningful way. So because it's a summative, as I mentioned before, there's no scaffolding. And we just want to understand if students can put those 3 dimensions together. They're short, they're focused, performance-based, and it's exactly what we want from a single performance expectation summative. Now, looking at how this assessment looked like, so this was a summative assessment for middle school physical science. It had 5 questions, 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional, and the standard was MSPS 1-7. As you can see here, we give students this scenario, this phenomena about this balloon blowing up. We have these questions, one targeting the cross-cutting concept right here at the top. Then the other one targets the science and engineering practice. And finally, we had a few that were targeting the sense-making, the 3 dimensions together, these sense-making questions. We actually had 2 more questions that were open-ended, but for the sake of space here, we only included 1. But that's kind of how the scaffold worked. So we had 2 2-dimensional questions at the top, and then 3 3-dimensional questions at the end for students to really engage in that sense-making performance. And then finally, this is the data that it yielded. When it comes to summative assessments, since we're measuring proficiency, the detail in the data may be harder to interpret than a formative assessment, because since we have the scaffolds, students can show their performance with different isolated dimensions, and we can spot things clearer. But actually, overall, these students did really well on this assessment. They scored about 75% on average, which gives us a good indication. They're actually demonstrating 3-dimensional proficiency at the end of this instruction. So they scored 77% with the DCIs. In this case, it was matter and its interactions, for the science and engineering practice of using mathematics and computational thinking. They also hit 77%. And then for the cross-cutting concept, about 74%. So this level of detail here helps us understand and identify that these are actually strengths that we're seeing in our students. It also might help us identify targeted gaps, and maybe we go back and understand if there's something that was missing in instruction, if there are any gaps. But at the end of the day, this is meant to measure proficiency and make data-informed decisions for future planning, even if it's from a single well-crafted assessment or a single performance expectation. All right, and I know this has been a little bit or a lot in about 35 minutes. But Emily is going to talk to us about what we could do next, and it's going to kind of summarize what we've already talked about.
Thank you so much, Julia, for going over all those different examples. It's always kind of nice to see what other people are doing and how they're doing it before like trying to dive in and try to do it all on your own. So just a kind of quick recap here, we've got this little cheat sheet for you, kind of talking about these different individual assessments, the purpose behind them, and when you would think about using them. So our first one is that diagnostic, and that purpose is to gauge that prior knowledge before instruction begins. So figuring out where your students are at before you start in order to then kind of tailor the instruction before they actually dive in. And like Julia mentioned, the timeline on here can be really flexible. You can look at as small as one lesson, or you can look at as big as an entire course. The next individual assessment is a formative assessment. The purpose behind this is to check for understanding during instruction. So right in the middle, you're getting that gauge of where they're at, and then you can collect that data in order to kind of pivot depending on where the strengths and weaknesses may fall. And again, you can make this as big as an entire course or as small as one individual lesson. And that last assessment is a summative assessment, and the purpose is to assess proficiency at the end of instruction. So this is your chance to be like, okay, did we get there? Did it happen? And again, as small as a lesson or as big as an entire course. So we're curious, after kind of listening through these three different ideas, which of these assessment strategies do you think would be a good starting point for you and your team? So whether it's just you or whether you are a department chair or a coordinator, which one of these do you think would be a great starting point as you're thinking about going into this new school year? If you wouldn't mind dropping into the chat. So diagnostic, formative, or summative? What do you think would be a great starting point for you all? All right, I'm seeing summative popping up. Summative is honestly a really solid starting point because I think it's what a lot of us are the most familiar with. Formative, diagnostic, beautiful, diagnostic. Oh my gosh, we don't really have a consensus, which is awesome. That kind of means depending, oh, actually now I'm seeing diagnostic quite a bit. I think diagnostic would be really interesting just in terms of where do we even start? Because if I assume they're here, but we're actually over here, that gives me a really good opportunity to be like, oh, okay, let's back it up before we get too far in, especially at the beginning of the year. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, everybody. All right. Now, you could have been watching this webinar and you could have been like, I don't even know if my students or me were there yet. And that's fair. Like we said, the NGSS is a beast to tackle as far as looking at those one-dimensional, two-dimensional, and three-dimensional questions and the phenomena, which is why next week we are hosting a webinar all about sense-making practice. And the idea by this is giving students informal opportunities to apply 3D thinking. So while this uses the Inner Orbit platform, one, it doesn't have to, but these are more activities that you could do with your students just to start testing the waters on looking at phenomena, looking at 2D and 3D questions, tackling this as a group. So this could be a great way to introduce either you or your students to sense making in a little bit more approachable, informal way. So if you'd like to join us for that webinar, go ahead and please click on that link over there. All right, so we are right at about 40 minutes. We said 45, not too bad. So a couple of things we want to leave you with here. If you are finishing this webinar with us and you are interested in trying out Inner Orbit, you want to try to pilot this in some way. You want to be able to get in there, look at our different questions that we have, build your own assessment. Please go ahead and fill out the interest form that Julia is going to drop in the chat. So this form will tell you just a little bit about you as far as how many students you serve, what your role is, and then somebody from our team will be reaching out to you incredibly shortly in order to help you get access to the site so you can start exploring on your own. Have a beautiful rest of your day, and we'll hopefully talk to you soon.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today.